Leon Festinger was one of the most influential social psychologists of our time. Literally. He's ranked as the fifth most eminent psychologist, and not just social psychologist, but psychologist, of the 20th century, just behind names like B.F. Skinner, Piaget, Freud, and Bandura. But Festinger's name might not stand out to you, like many of the other names on this list. You may be more familiar with his social psychological theories, which include both cognitive dissonance and social comparison theories. These theories essentially cemented Festinger's legacy within the domain of social psychology. But even more interestingly, Festinger did not begin nor end his career as a social psychologist. I'll explain this in a bit. Festinger was born in Brooklyn, New York on May 8, 1919, to Russian Jewish immigrants Alex and Sarah Solomon Festinger. He went to Boys High School in Brooklyn and received his Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the City College of New York in 1939. As an undergraduate, Festinger became interested in some of the work Kurt Lewin had done with his group in Berlin. This included tension systems and the remembering and completion of interrupted tasks, boundaries and psychological satiation, and so on. For that reason, he began his graduate education at the University of Iowa under the mentorship of Lewin in 1939, who had since fled from Nazi Germany to the United States. Unfortunately for Festinger, by the time he arrived at Iowa, Lewin had mostly shifted his program of research to group dynamics and social psychology. As I previously mentioned, Festinger did not begin his professional career as a social psychologist, and he was not interested in Lewin's new work and found the methodology to be loose. He instead chose to study Lewin's older ideas throughout graduate school, which could be tested with more rigorous methodology. In fact, Festinger, who went on to become one of the most influential social psychologists of our time, did not take a single social psychology class while he was studying at the University of Iowa. In 1945, Festinger joined Kurt Lewin as an assistant professor at the newly established Research Center for Group Dynamics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In Festinger's own words, "At this time I became, by fiat, a social psychologist and immersed myself in the field with all its difficulties, vagueness, and challenges." With that being said, he recounted that these years were filled with excitement, and he believed the work at the center was the beginning of something important. As a social psychologist, Festinger introduced a number of new ideas and theories to the field. His two most influential contributions, however, are social comparison theory and cognitive dissonance. First up, social comparison theory. According to his 1954 article titled A Theory of Social Comparison Processes, this theory has a few main hypotheses. First, humans have a drive to evaluate their opinions and abilities. Second, to the extent that objective, non-social means are available, people evaluate their own opinions and abilities by comparing them to the opinions and abilities of others. So, height is something that is objective, so you could easily compare that to other people and figure out if you're taller or shorter. But what about a much more abstract concept like intelligence? How do you compare that to others? Now, social comparison can serve a number of functions, and it can depend on an individual's goal. One common goal that utilizes social comparison is self-evaluation. Say you are a freshman psychology student at a major public research university in the United States. In order to accurately evaluate yourself and abilities, you would compare yourself to other freshman psychology students at your school or other research universities. This comparison could give you valuable feedback on your performance as a student. You wouldn't compare yourself to tenured psychology professors, and you wouldn't compare yourself to first graders, because of course you have far more knowledge than first graders and far less knowledge than tenured professors. If you have a goal of self-enhancement or improving your self-esteem, you could utilize social comparison theory in a different way, By using downward social comparison, you compare yourself to people who are worse than you, which makes you feel better about your own abilities. On the other hand, if you are motivated to improve yourself, you might use the opposite, upward social comparison, to compare your abilities to someone better than you in order to motivate yourself to improve. As a freshman psychology student, you might compare yourself to the graduate students in your lab in hopes of gaining the same research skills as them. These are some of the ways social comparison theory can be applied to everyday life. Next, we will discuss perhaps Festinger's most influential theory, cognitive dissonance. This theory states that all people strive for internal psychological consistency. When an individual experiences internal inconsistency, it negatively affects their psychological state, and they are motivated to reduce the inconsistency. For instance, say an individual smokes cigarettes. Let's also say this individual is aware that smoking cigarettes can cause cancer. These are two competing ideas that would certainly cause cognitive dissonance. Why would this individual continue smoking cigarettes when they are fully aware it could lead to them getting cancer? This dissonance will motivate the individual to reduce it and achieve an internally consistent state. This can be done in a few ways. First, the individual could change the inconsistent behavior or cognition. An example of this would be to stop smoking because it causes cancer. Most people don't stop smoking this easily, however. Therefore, they must use another strategy to address the dissonance. This typically involves the addition of new cognitions. For instance, an individual might justify their cigarette use by saying they will quit smoking after they finish their current pack. This reduces dissonance even if it does not target the problem. Now, the idea of cognitive dissonance is a relatively simple idea, and Festinger was not the first person to think of it. What he did do with it, however, was rigorously test it in nearly every situation he could imagine. In one of Festinger's classic experiments, he had participants perform an extremely dull and boring peg-turning task. Then, he asked the participants if they could introduce the task to the next participant and lie that it was actually an exciting task. Half of the participants were paid $20 to lie, and the other half was only paid $1 to lie. The participant paid $20 felt appropriately compensated for having to lie, and thus experienced no dissonance. He still believed the task was boring, even after lying about it. The participant who was paid only $1, on the other hand, was not sufficiently compensated for lying about the task. As a result, she experienced dissonance, and in order to resolve this, she compensated by changing her cognition and convincing herself that the task was actually fun. Here we can see an original participant as well as Festinger himself discussing the experiment.
Did you enjoy working on the manual task?
Yes, I enjoyed it.
Would you like to participate in such an experiment again?
Yes, I think I would like to.
Anytime there is insufficient reward, there will be dissonance. The general principle seems to be that people come to believe in and to love the things they have to suffer for.
So, I previously mentioned that Festinger did not begin nor end his career as a social psychologist, and that's true. Festinger was a true intellectual who was constantly seeking new ways to challenge his mind. When one area became dull for him, he shifted his interest. This led to him ending his work as a social psychologist. In 1963, while at Stanford, he began a new area of research in a completely unrelated field, vision and perception. His work in this field garnered a lot of attention and drew talented students to work with him. In 1968, Festinger returned to New York to continue his perception research at the New School. Approximately 11 years later, in 1979, he closed his laboratory and retired from experimental psychological research, citing disillusionment with the progress of the field. As an older man, Festinger did not experience the same excitement with small discoveries that he had experienced in his youth. He was unhappy with the progress made in understanding human behavior over his 40-year career as a psychologist. He felt that the new knowledge was not impressive enough, and some of the most important problems had not been addressed. As a result, Festinger moved away from experimental psychology and entered an entirely new academic pursuit. He became interested in learning about the nature of man through the use of archaeological data. He visited archaeological sites around the world and tried to deduce what he could about man and primitive societies from the digs of these sites. He compiled his findings in the 1983 book, The Human Legacy. After his psychosocial archaeological pursuits, Festinger turned to the history of religion. He acquainted himself with church scholars and dove deeply into this work. Unfortunately, he was unable to publish on this topic before his death. In 1988, Festinger became ill with an aggressive form of cancer that metastasized to the liver and lungs. After using his scientific mind to consider the treatments, side effects, odds of living, and quality of life, he decided to not seek treatment and die. After a few months, Leon Festinger had passed away. Leon Festinger was an individual who excelled at everything he did. He may be most remembered for his work in social psychology, but he poured his heart into a number of disciplines, both within and outside the domain of psychology. He was truly one of a kind, and certainly deserves his spot among the most eminent psychologists of our time.